the whole time. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our candidate today, Dr. Greg Paul, who is department head and professor at Kansas State University's Department of Communication Studies. So some of you may already know him because he has deep roots in Texas. He got his undergrad, master's, and PhD degree all from Texas A&M University. So he probably knows much more about this school than I do. Dr. Paul's research focuses on generally on the construction of communities, both at work and at home. He specifically explores issues related to restorative justice, conflict management in the workplace, forgiveness and revenge, dialogue and deliberation. He has conducted research that explores how facilitators of victim-offender dialogue understand justice and their roles in helping participants to accomplish justice. His work has been published in a variety of journals, such as Conflict Resolution Quarterly and Communication Quarterly. And also I'd like to point out that Greg recently, I think as of last year, published a book on, gosh, I should know the title, on his research. It is very interesting book. I looked at it briefly. It's published by Lexington Press, so that's his most recent publication. So, so without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Greg and let him introduce to us his research. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's really, I'm delighted to be with all of you today. A little bit jealous of the warmer weather down there, as we were just talking about, but this is a real treat for me. Can I just get a quick thumbs up that you can see the PowerPoint slide? Is that visible? All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. So, yes, what I'd like to do today is to talk with you more about what I'm calling or framing as the scholarship of learning, growth, and support. And so these values of learning, growth, and support are principles that I really thread throughout all dimensions of my scholarship. And so I'm going to be talking about scholarship broadly, while also talking about my research in particular. So over the next 30 minutes or so, what I want to do is to talk with you, and I'm a fan of alliteration, so I just sort of lean into it, going through some of the foundations and frameworks and focus areas and future aspirations of my work. And then happy to talk through questions or opportunities or ideas as they come up. So let's start, I guess, with some of the foundational areas of my research, and many of you were able to get a front row seat at the emergence of these areas. So as I started my journey as a scholar, I was really drawn to especially these ideas of organizational communication and conflict management. That's one of the reasons as a graduate student, I pursued training as a mediator. It's one of the reasons that when I first moved up to Pennsylvania and lived in Lancaster, I went through training to become a victim offender conference facilitator, and then trained with the Public Conversations Project over in Boston in terms of dialogue facilitators or dialogue facilitation. And so I was really drawn to these questions about how do we help people work through difficult situations or questions, especially in the workplace? How do we set up workplace systems that help people to work through conflict effectively? And I'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. I also was really drawn to this. I didn't really have a label for it at the time, but what I now frame as sort of this methodological pragmatism. So I wanted to get as many of these tools in my tool belt that would help me be able to explore the questions that that just arose organically. And so you'll see throughout today, using interviews, using quantitative research, structural equation modeling, and things like that, because I value these different methods as tools to help me explore some of these questions. And then especially starting off this journey or starting off this work, I was really drawn to this practice of forgiveness, really curious about why would people forgive someone who hurt them? How did they go about forgiving people who hurt them, especially in the context of work, where if we're talking about conventional workplace systems that, let's face it, are pretty impersonal, that don't exactly allow for a whole lot of room for emotion. Forgiveness is not necessarily a topic that comes up or may not necessarily be encouraged. And so I was drawn to this question of what is it about workplaces that promote forgiveness or may actually perversely promote revenge, these types of retributive behaviors in the workplace. And so it was in the context of exploring forgiveness that I remember coming across an article by Deb Kidder titled Restorative Justice, Not Rights, but the Right Way to Resolve Conflict at Work. And I thought, I've never heard of this term. What is this? And as I read, what I found in her description of restorative justice resonated really strongly with me as kind of my sense about, wow, what if we actually could work through difficult situations or harmful situations using these types of dialogic processes or keeping these goals in mind? And it really sparked in me an interest to want to learn more. And that really provided a jumping off to some of these frameworks that have guided my research since. And so there are a number of them, but I want to focus on three in particular, that of restorative justice, that of conflict transformation, and that of, if I'm going to use a term from Simpson and Siebold here, practical engagement. So let's explore this restorative justice element, and I'll be talking about it at length today. So if there's a shorthand for restorative justice, it's the phrase making things right. So when something harmful happens, there are a number of consequences to the harm. There are a number of dimensions to that harm. For example, it was actually while I was doing some interviewing on this practice of forgiveness that I remember getting a phone call from a home security company saying that my alarm was going off and would I like to call the police? And I said, yes, please call the police. And I came home to a house that had been broken into and a laptop stolen. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really rough. And I started processing, like, what is it that I need in this moment? And restorative justice, in some ways, provides a language or provides a framework for kind of working through the harm and trying to set right those different material and emotional and relational dimensions that have been damaged by wrongdoing. And oftentimes, restorative justice is compared with what I call conventional justice, what other people call retributive justice in a number of ways. One of those ways, for example, is in the outcomes. Whereas conventional restorative justice focuses on things like punishment or retribution, some people would call it revenge, in response to a wrong or a harm doing. Restorative justice asks, well, what do you need as the victim? What does the offender need to do as the wrongdoer to help make things right materially, emotionally, relationally, and as a community? So maybe it means we need an apology. Maybe it means I need the person who broke into my house to pay for the fixes to my front door, right? And so these outcomes aren't determined by the state, but rather determined by the people who have been affected by the wrongdoing. That's one element. Another area in which restorative justice differs is in terms of process, whereas conventional justice deals a lot with more impersonal processes like trials or arbitration. Restorative justice really emphasizes dialogic processes like victim offender conferences and peace circles and truth and reconciliation commissions. which then leads to the third area of difference, which is in how they frame wrongdoing. Whereas in conventional justice, wrongdoing is often framed as a harm against the state or a harm against the institution. In restorative justice, it's more typically framed as a harm against a person or the relationship or the community at large. And so my interest in this really began in more of the legal setting around juvenile justice. And I was really drawn to some of these values that underlie restorative justice, such as accountability and support. So there's a model called the social discipline window that asserts that when wrongdoing occurs, one of the ways to respond is to blend both accountability as well as support for the person who did the wrong, to say it's not enough just to punish you, which would be high accountability, low support, but rather to say it's up to you, person who did the wrongdoing, to make this right. And so there's a blending of accountability and support. There's a blending or an emphasis on learning and growth by everyone who's been affected. There's an emphasis on peace and healing, so the ability to move forward and not be stuck. And I'll talk about stuck communities here in a little bit, drawing on some of the work of Peter Block. There's an emphasis on community and relationships, and those sort of get marginalized when we think about conventional justice. But in restorative justice, there's this sense of we are in part who we are because of our connections with other people, and community and relationships really matter. And even more recently, there's been a focus on non-oppression and emancipation as restorative justice practitioners focus not just on the procedural elements like victim offender conferencing, but also some of the political or the structural incorporation as we say, what would a restorative framework mean for the way that we organize as communities or as organizations to build systems that are free from oppression, but are instead supportive and enable growth. And so as I was continuing to do research in restorative justice, I was also continuing to be drawn to this work by John Paul Lederach and others in conflict transformation. And one of the reasons that conflict transformation really resonates with me is that it moves, it's another step beyond just simply managing or ending a conflict, but more seeing conflict as sort of this life-giving opportunity. We have a chance to grow through our disagreements or through our conflicts with one another and create these change opportunities. And obviously, you know, especially as, you know, colleges or our budget models change, there are definitely constructive change processes that are out there and opportunities to be seized. But conflict transformation focuses on change that reduce violence and that increase justice through direct, so think dialogic, direct interaction and social structures. And respond to real life problems, again, something that really resonates with me throughout our human relationships. And so there's this real emphasis on the conversational, the dialogic, the tangible, as a way to say, let's not get stuck in these conflicts, but let's find a way to develop systems, to develop ways of thinking and communicating that allow us to make progress and make change for the better. Right. And so I think as we talk about, for example, outcomes and processes, that you'll see a lot of resonance between restorative justice and conflict transformation. For example, you likely see some of the similarities here in terms of outcomes of conflict transformation, in terms of growth and peace and justice, learning, perspective taking, healing and interdependence. There's this real sense of us being able to make progress together rather than justice as an individual thing or as a punitive thing. There's an emphasis on sustained dialogue, which I think is something that has really come into the fore lately in the restorative justice work. So instead of just looking at processes like victim offender conferencing, we're asking questions like, how do we make this a larger part of the system so that we can be promoting sustained dialogue in these different settings, especially in K-12 settings, where we're trying to help students learn how do you work through difference and how do you celebrate difference together so that when they go out there and they are fully functioning citizens responsible for all these different decisions, they know how to, they have the skills, right? They have the capacity to work through difficult situations. Another element that I think resonates with me is that conflict transformation is systemic and multi-level. So Lederach talks about transformation that occurs individually, relationally, societally, and then culturally. And so we can't just pursue conflict transformation at one level because it's all in many ways integrated together. And so we have an opportunity as scholars of conflict transformation to be making progress and partnering with people to make progress on some of these difficult issues, which of course leads to the third element of practical engagement, that term that I borrow from Simpson and Siebold. This is something that I've been really exploring more and find myself gravitating increasingly towards, is this practice or even this orientation of engaged scholarship. And I'll draw on the work by Shockley Zalabek, Barge, Lewis, and Simpson here in describing this as being based on the need to attend to, talk about, respond to a complex and often troubled world, which I think kind of resonates with us in terms of what we're seeing out there. And it's something that this emphasis on co-creation or doing scholarship with people kind of resonates with this relational community emphasis that is threaded throughout my scholarship. And so I appreciate its blending of theory and practice, its emphasis on reflexivity and ethicality. And so what I've tried to do is throughout my scholarship to be using these principles and exploring these in many of the projects that I take on in the different trajectories or focus areas of my work. So if I can kind of use these pairings here, these emphases on restoration and transformation, these emphases on both the individual and the collective, or the together, the emphasis on not just process and structure, but also on outcome. So how do we accomplish what we need to be able to move forward? This blending of theory and practice, and this blending of meaning and behavior. And so I think what you'll see is that these concepts are threaded out some of these focus areas that I'm going to talk about next in terms of my research. And I've generally tried to capture these in a couple of buckets or a couple of areas. One is in this area of building just systems. And then another area is in the area of constructing justice. And so I want to go into each of these different areas more specifically to dive into not just the research that I've done, but also the research that I hope to do going forward. So when I talk about building just systems, one of the first questions that came to me as I was learning more about restorative justice and becoming a facilitator and training other facilitators in communication and asking questions was, why would anyone want to do this? I mean, so the prospect of sitting down with someone who hurt you or who you've hurt can be really daunting, right? And as I thought about my own experience of having my car broken into, or even when I was at ICA a few years ago in Puerto Rico, having my car broken into, yeah, I've had a wonderful experience with some of these things. Asking, what would I want to say to these people who stole my stuff or tried to steal my stuff? And so I was really intrigued by these motivational factors, especially for the part of people who've been wronged, for victims, to ask, what would make you want to sit down and talk with the person who's hurt you? And I'm going to show you a model here from a few years ago that I developed, but some of the findings from that research are, kind of resonate with some of these principles of restorative justice, and that some of the main factors that influence people's motivation are wanting to get information, asking the question, Why did you do this to me? These are questions that I've also, when I was facilitating these victim offender conferences, I've heard victims ask offenders, basically, why me? What were you thinking? Why did you do this, right? So the desire to get information, reduce uncertainty, as well as the desire to help the person who did the wrong, help the offender to experience restoration. There was this real, especially in the case of youth, desire for the youth to get on a better path or to get back on the right path, so they didn't stay stuck in the systems or the behaviors that they were in right now. And then a little bit later, I was continuing to do this research and perceptions of victim offender conferences. And what I was finding is that one of the key factors that also influenced participation was the extent to which people saw victim offender conferences as being appropriate in the first place. Was this even the right approach to do? Why not let the courts just handle this? Right. So especially for these first two elements, and I apologize for the number of circles and arrows that you're about to see here, but this is one of the models that came out of this this research. And instead of going through the whole thing, right, which again, really daunting, I want to highlight just a few areas that have really sparked some more questions for me. For example, this desire to get information. I started thinking, well, I wonder if it's not just the desire to get information. I wonder if it's also the desire to share your own story, which is a key element. We might call these key elements that produce these dialogic moments of mutuality here, where we can go, oh, now I see what you felt. Here is what I felt, right? Let's see if we can, in some ways, accomplish justice together, right? So, and this is something that very much separates victim offender conferences from more conventional processes like trials, where offenders are in some ways discouraged from sharing anything because it could get them into trouble. So in addition to obtaining answers, there was also this emphasis, again, of wanting the youth to get back on the right path. And I'll come back to this a little later with a belief elicitation study that I did. But there's sort of this hopeful, hey, you know what? I was in your shoes when I was a youth. I don't want you to make some of the same mistakes I did. I want you to learn. But also curious for me was this function of apology. And something that that's been interesting to me is the sort of dual role of apology as both restorative as well as punitive. So it's this notion of, yes, I want you to apologize because I want to reconcile with you, hence the emphasis on or the influence of relational rebalance. But there's also this positive association with punishment. I want you to feel shame. I want you to be sorry for what you did to me. And so I want you to sit there and say a genuine apology. And so in the restorative justice literature, there's something called reintegrative shaming. And it's tied in with something called conditional forgiveness. I'm willing to forgive you, but I need you to own up to the harm that you did to me, right? And once you do that, take responsibility, then we can work together. Right. So what kind of emerged for me out of this sense was, all right, restorative justice is not something that's sort of a dualistic opposite here, but it's something that can be integrated with conventional justice. Another question that emerged for me was, how do we go about practicing restorative justice, especially in the area of facilitation? So interviewing facilitators, interviewing mediators to ask them about their beliefs about what makes for an effective facilitator. How are you trained as a mediator? What are you hoping to accomplish? And so you can see some of the work done in that area. And then a third area deals with, again, some of the structural or larger scale areas of incorporation of restorative justice, not only in community settings, So some of the work that I did in Kansas and meeting or having these deliberative conversations with folks all around Kansas about how to promote positive youth development and support for youth, right? But also in workplace settings, exploring the role of emotions and dispute management systems. And the ways that they can encourage some of these restorative practices in the workplace. And so my aim is to continue to build on this work, for example, by looking at socialization practices. What are some of the ways that the way that we parent, for example, influences children's or youth beliefs about justice or beliefs about the appropriate ways to get justice? How do we build what are called healing organizations? And in some ways, I'm also drawing on the work by Fair and Gelfand talking about forgiving organizations, so that when wrongdoing occurs, we can actually grow through it because these things can make us stronger. I'm also working with a colleague on, she has a simulator, working on kind of de-escalation techniques, especially for law enforcement, but also with school personnel in this area. And then sort of an emerging or burgeoning interest area that I saw in these conversations around Kansas was the importance of financial education for folks, because obviously money and the stressors that come with money are sometimes layered on with these concerns about justice and keeping people down or not helping people to be able to make progress. And so that's kind of one area for me. A second area is that of constructing justice. And I kind of used a shorthand a little earlier in terms of making things right. And that I think is helpful kind of at a really big picture. And obviously, you know, some of the early work was done around victim offender conferencing, but there's been increasing work that I find myself gravitating towards that's tried to expand some of the boundaries of restorative justice. For example, Mara Schiff and David Hooker frame restorative justice as something that helps to cause a new possibility. You're really highlighting non-oppression and non-domination based ecology. So I think of some of the work by like Dave Matthews and his ecology of democracy right here. And restorative justice is very much one of these democratic approaches to justice. But it's not just a way to resolve or address harm, but it's a way to sort of make sense out of the world around us, right? Thalia Gonzalez writes or describes restorative justice a little bit with a little bit more of a political edge to it, describing it as a political demand for emancipation, for an end to domination and oppression, and the right to have a meaningful rather than tokenized voice. And you know, I've been kind of building on some of these themes going forward, especially in looking at how people conceptualize what justice is and the belief elicitation or trying to elicit these beliefs that people have about restorative justice. One of my favorites was when I did this survey and I asked people what came to their mind when they heard the word restorative justice. One person responded along the lines of, oh, an Obama era experiment that's doomed to fail, something like that. Even though many people trace the origins of restorative justice actually back to the Maori and even earlier of these different people groups. And so I want to walk a little bit through some of these elements of belief elicitation here. So I presented folks with a scenario and was like, so what would you want to see happen if you had someone break into your house and let's say they damaged or stole $1,000 worth of stuff? And you can see kind of this progression here as people walk through, well, with the offender, I want to see them punished. One person said, I want to see them meet the business end of my 22, which, whoa, right? Really aggressive. And yet when it came to themselves, it's, I want restitution. I want to be paid back for the harm that was done to me. But then this last column is also really interesting, that when people were presented with this idea of participating in a victim offender conference, you can see the marked shift to say, I want to feel safe again. I want to know why they did that. I want to tell the youth that they can do something better, right? So even presenting people with an option can help to shift the way they think about or even talk about justice in these types of harm situations. We also ask them to talk about some of the feelings that they would have or emotions that they would have if they were able to meet or not meet their goals in a victim offender conference. And you see, for example, this emphasis on satisfaction. I would feel happy, I would feel satisfied if I were able to be repaid, or I would be dissatisfied if the youth weren't able to repay me. But you can also see the emotions related to anger and peace, security and lack of safety or insecurity, right? So speaking to some of these affective dimensions of harm, right? That it's not just a material issue, but we in some ways are changed as people and our relationships are changed as a result of harm doing. Which of course, speaking of, we were also interested in, people around you are probably going to have something to say. If you were thinking about going through a victim offender conference, who are those people? And probably not all that surprising was that immediate family had the closest or most proximal influence, but also best friends, close others were also pretty important, especially with regard to supporting. But one of the more interesting elements to me, because we were using sort of a theory of plain behavior framework for this, was we were asking what would help, what would hinder your ability to participate. For the most part, people focused inward. So it's not something related to the offender or related to the offense. It was more like, would I feel safe? Would I feel prepared? Would I feel like this would actually work for me? It was more these intrinsic elements that really shaped people's interest in going through a victim offender conference. And so I've continued to build on some of this work as I've really moved into this more communication perspective. So the book Creating Restorative Justice kind of builds on this, and it builds on Peter Block's notion of restorative community and Fania Davis's notion of restorganizing, especially in the context of whole school organization, whole school restorative justice. To basically start asking questions of, what are the metaphors that we're using when we talk about restorative justice? And what are some ways that we can essentially dislodge restorative justice from its current reference of justice as we know it in the West, and maybe redefine it as into something that's more holistic, relational, and multidimensional. And so in many ways, that's some of the work that is going to be coming up. Over the summer, I'm going to be working with some folks through the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice, and doing what in some ways is a focus group with researchers and practitioners, working through definitions, standards, expectations, aspirations of restorative justice, and in some ways laying sort of a training framework for facilitators, and then also continuing to explore some of these linguistic underpinnings of justice going forward. So if I can wrap up as well over the next couple minutes, because it's 10:35 as well, I want to focus on a few areas in terms of my future aspirations for my work. So for example, contributing to building systems of justice, asking questions like, how can we help people work through difficult or hurtful situations? What are some ways that we can build systems of support in relationships, in workplaces, in our larger community, right? What are some ways that we can be reconstructing justice, maybe even in our policies or in the language that we use, that helps people to be able to re-envision or reimagine what justice can look like? If I can use the Matthews phrase again, the scholarship for the common good, right? Something that helps all of us collectively to be able to move forward. In terms of my continuing to facilitate learning, growth, and support, this is where I envision this happening in all dimensions of my scholarship. So for example, through my teaching and advising, continuing to develop my own practices and access and inclusion so that people, regardless of their background, regardless of their financial situation, are able to make progress on their various goals for their community or for their careers, emphasizing dialogue and application in the classroom. Anna and I were talking a little bit earlier this morning, and what we were talking about with translational and public and participatory scholarship, I was saying was really resonating with me because my aspiration is to continue this work in public facing and engaged scholarship, as well as to continue my efforts in funded work, whether it's through the Kettering Foundation or through other types of organizations. And then in terms of service and administration, obviously that's a huge step forward with being a Hispanic serving institution that is near and dear to my heart, given my own family history. So contributing to this notion of servingness, contributing to efforts around accessibility and inclusion within higher education, because there's such an opportunity for growth here. And then in terms of my own development, really continuing my work in andragogy and borrowing from Tim Schafer's work in deliberative pedagogy. There's still a whole lot that I want to be able to do in this area. Again, in terms of research, I've been talking with a colleague of mine, Mike Young, who's been regaling me with tales of Bayesian statistics, and I go, I think I want to learn more about that. So learning more in that area and just continuing my growth in terms of methodology overall and participatory methods, engaged methods, and things like that. In terms of service, obviously being not only a good citizen within the department and within the university, but pursuing leadership in organizations like the International Association for Conflict Management, where I was a program planner a couple of years ago and sit on the editorial board for their journal, Negotiation and Conflict Management Research. And then continuing to get more involved with NACRJ. And then continuing to pursue some opportunities that I've had to press the pause button on since moving into this administrative position. But opportunities, for example, with the Rotary Peace Fellowship, that's something that's been hanging out there as an aspiration of mine, working with the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Kettering Foundation. So if I can sum up what I think kind of captures the last 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, is this emphasis on building these systems that promote justice, really through all dimensions of my scholarship for the common good. And my hope is that whether it's through my teaching, my research, my service, I can be contributing to people's learning and growth, be contributing by supporting people to continue their own growth now and then going forward. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to chatting with you further.
Thank you, Greg. So I am going to be facilitating the Q&A portion today. So I just want to go ahead and open the floor for any questions or comments. Kevin, I see that you are unmuted.
Yes. Okay. Hey, Greg. Really enjoyed the presentation and kind of hearing the overview and the trajectory of where you'd like to go. And I was reminded when you talked about the public conversations projects, one of my favorite quotes about dialogue is from the founder, Sally Ann Roth, who says, "Dialogue ends when the body bags begin." And I've always thought that's both been depressing, but also quite true about the power of language to kind of create better social worlds. But I guess what I'd be curious about, I want to hear a little bit more about how you kind of conceptualize and think about kind of issues of dialogue and collaboration, because one critique of dialogue and collaborative work is it can stifle dissenting voices, that it doesn't necessarily give full attention to issues of power and critique, kind of the injustice elements you're gesturing towards the end. I was thinking about, for example, like Shiv Ganesh and Heather Zoller's work on agonistic dialogue, where dialogue is both in a sense, a competitive, but also a collaborative process that you have to balance that. Could you say a little bit about how you're thinking about issues of power and resistance and critique kind of enter into your practice and your theorizing about dialogue and collaboration?
I really appreciate that question because it's a question that I often get into with some of the folks associated with debate. And we have long conversations about the role of critique and debate and dialogue deliberation, how all of those come together. Yes, and we tackle this, I'm gonna really approach this from the Restorative Justice Victim Offender Conference area here. One of the critiques of victim offender conferences is that it can basically force people into a setting where they feel like they have to artificially pursue this reconciliation that they really actually don't want, and that almost creates this artificial environment that actually leads to more harm. And so as I've kind of worked through my own thinking, in some ways, I think this is where some of the like the backstory or the background work comes into play. Where if I'm meeting with victims or I'm meeting with offenders, I'm doing a whole lot of listening and I'm doing a whole lot of preparation work and trying to be sensitive to what is it that they're needing in the situation, so that I don't, for example, re-victimize the person who was hurt, or so that I don't hang the wrongdoer out to be publicly pilloried again. You know, so this is where, in some ways, I think we can't just look at it as a process, but we've also got to look at the larger social systems in which these types of processes are enacted. Because if we're still trying to enact these dialogic processes within structures that are more competitive or oppressive or top down, you're exactly right. It can lead to situations where, for example, Anna, I was just reading some of the work that you were doing, people kind of gravitate toward the extremes, and then it sort of corrodes these dialogic moments. And so in some ways, I look at it as you've got to hold both of them, and you've got to be attentive to not only the coming together, the mutuality part, but you also have to be attentive to the power dynamics at play, and make sure that you're not re-oppressing or re-victimizing people who are already in a one-down situation. And that's where some of the work that I'm doing in exploring these linguistic underpinnings of justice is coming into play, where right now we're in such a top-down bureaucratic understanding of justice. It's more punitive. And I think it kind of prevents us from exploring some of these other approaches to justice that can kind of push against it. So that's a really long answer, I think, to what really is a systemic issue that I'm trying to be sensitive to when I think about questions of ripeness, or I think about questions of how do we construct justice, or ways that we incorporate these into larger systems.
I actually want to pick up on this, but turn us towards your methods a little bit. So you've mentioned that you have this ambition to examine more of the linguistic underpinnings of justice, and you through the results and the implications of your structural model of restorative justice. But I would love to just hear you elaborate on the methods that you used then, and sort of how you've used structural equation modeling, but also like that's not typically what's used for looking at linguistic underpinnings. So I'm assuming you might be using other approaches. So just if you can elaborate on the methods that you're using for this research.
Sure. So, for example, when I was talking about meaning and behavior, right? The structural equation modeling, hierarchical linear regression, great for looking at behavior, not so great for looking at how people define restorative justice. And so, for example, when I think about structural equation modeling, hierarchical linear regression, some of the path analysis that I've been able to do, that's where those are really useful for looking at, for example, socialization practices or effectiveness. although effectiveness is such a complex word that I want to sort of hold that term a little loosely here. And so that's one bucket. But I also have, using these textual methods that utilize discourse analysis, thematic analysis, that I think would be useful for exploring these linguistic underpinnings of justice. And so really talking, like at NACRJ coming up this summer, talking individually and as a group with these scholars and practitioners to ask, what exactly are you talking about with restorative justice? Because when we look through the journals of contemporary justice review, it seems like every other article is sort of this, and I've used this term before, this evangelical treatise about what restorative justice should mean. There are as many definitions out there as there are people. And so that's where I think some of these more interpretive, discourse sensitive methods would be more appropriate.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you.
good. Yeah, you bet.
Okay, so the floor is open. People can either raise a hand, unmute themselves, or indicate in the chat that they have a question, and I'll sort of build the stack from there. So who else has a question that hasn't talked yet? Yeah, go ahead, Hart. You.
Still trying to, I needed a second more to frame it, but I guess one of the things I'm thinking, so I've had my cars broken into and my house broken into multiple times. And I think if I were a better person in each of those instances, I would want restorative justice because I would have some buy-in in improving this person. But I want rehabilitation. I want them to gain skills. If there are drug problems, I want for them to get the help that they need. If there's education, I want them to get that. I want them to be connected to a system that cares about them and doesn't just throw them back out into the street. I want all of these things more than punishment. But I don't know that I really want to be that involved. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, what is the value added of restorative justice over rehabilitation? And how much is that for the victim versus the offender? And I realize you have a whole book on this. I'm up to chapter 3, so I'll try to get through the rest for tomorrow. So maybe that answers my question. But I mean, it's that, and I guess part of what I'm also seeing in this is that I think your model, you often refer to community, and it feels to me like you're working under situations in which there's an interdependence between the victim and the offender, and maybe even a shared identity. It seems like there's some connections there that I will say I have not felt with the people who've been taking my stuff. So even when the videotape showed me that it was my neighbor's kids, I still didn't feel that much of a connection. So I'll yield for.
I am sorry that you experienced that. It is not a great feeling, is it? Yeah, so I'll take this in a couple of areas. One is the thinking around community, and I think the other is what's in it for the person like us who have been hurt, right? And so with community, that is one of the underlying just core assumptions that distinguishes restorative justice from conventional justice. In conventional justice, we're dealing with individuals, right? So you have the scales of justice, right? And in restorative justice, the assumption is we are automatically, as people, related to one another. Now, some of those networks can be really far apart, right? And so I may not necessarily have a relationship with you, but I am connected to you in some ways because we are human beings on this little blue ball. We live in the same community, probably. You might even be a neighbor of mine. So we do have at least some connection there. And so part of this is the reframing of justice as something that recognizes the importance of relationships, even when those relationships have been harmed or severed by someone else's wrongdoing, right? And so restorative justice says, look, even if you don't feel connected, We understand that we're all interdependent with one another. And instead of having this sort of contrarian interdependence, if I can use one of those systems thinking words, let's see if we can actually develop a sense of promotive interdependence with one another, because we're all trying to get through this together. And so when I talk about community, I'm going to use some of Dave Proctor's work here too, right? There's this geographic sense of community. There's this relational sense of community, but there's also this symbolic or constitutive sense of community as something that gets created through language, right? And so I find myself moving really through all three of those senses of community. And I think the book really emphasizes this symbolic understanding of community and the role that justice plays in developing our sense of community. So that's one bucket. The other bucket, in terms of rehabilitation, yes, that is one of the areas that facilitators have to talk about when they're often meeting with victims. Is people will say the exact same thing you did. I want the person who hurt me to get help. I don't particularly want to sit down and talk with the person because I don't know what I'm going to do if I walk into a room and they're there. Right. In fact, I remember very vividly facilitating or having a pre-meeting with someone who was victimized by a simple assault. It was a high school student, and another high schooler came around and just punched him in the back of the head. Actually, I was meeting with the kid who did the punching, and that kid's parents were in the room and said, we actually don't think that our kid was wrong, right? In the same situation, we would support him doing it all over again because this is why he did it. And I was like, nope, we are not having this conversation, because if I put the two of you in a room, bad things are just going to happen, right? And so for victims in particular, it's, this creates an investment, an obligation on my part that I don't really want to have. So have them go and do 100 hours of community service, pay me back, and I'm good, right? And I think that's kind of this influence of our conventional justice model way of thinking, where we look at individuals. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm saying that it's reflective of this individualistic understanding that we have of justice. And then we also, without pressuring the victim, also talk through the opportunities that come into being when you get to ask your questions of your neighbor's kid who broke in or did whatever that they did, right? And what I find is that when I talk with the victims about that, they go, oh, okay, well, let me think about that a little bit more, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be able to get those questions answered in real time. So yeah, there are a number of dimensions at work, right? And there's no easy decision-making calculus. It's so individualized when it comes to people's willingness to participate.
Well, it sounds like one of the things you're saying, whereas I was saying, I was kind of treating community as a moderator variable. So I'm saying, if I have it, maybe I'd want to do it. But it sounds like you're sort of pushing this when you say promotive community. Community is also an outcome that is of interest, not simply an assumption of when this would be done.
Yeah,
that's what you're trying to construct.
Yeah, well, and in restorative justice, the constructions of community are so slippery and varied. Some people talk about community as a stakeholder, right? And so we have neighborhood accountability boards, right? Other people talk about community as an outcome, that we construct a sense of community through these dialogues. And so, yeah, just the way that we talk about community differs based on the questions or the approaches that we're taking to this practice of restorative justice.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, which probably means one more question. Does anyone have one more question? Go ahead, Tasha.
This has been so much fun. I have so thoroughly enjoyed listening to this. And I've been taking notes the entire time, so I'm looking forward to our conversation later this afternoon. So I'll put that over there. But for now, one of the things that you brought up a couple times was, the issues around restorative justice and juvenile justice in particular. You mentioned K through 12 context. So I'm wondering if you could kind of surface for us the importance of restorative justice for younger communities or for younger folk, and kind of what your experiences have been.
That's a great question. I remember talking with a youth court person, and what she said struck me. Like, one of the biggest predictors of someone's likelihood to recidivate is age. Basically, the younger you are, you're thinking. This is where I start going into some psychophysiological stuff, like your lid is flipped, and you're thinking with that amygdala here. Sometimes you just do things on impulse, and then as you mature, you just go, "Wow, that was not smart to go out there and start throwing rocks at people's car," right? But even at a young age, and my kids are in 3rd and 6th grade, and we're trying to socialize them into using their words to talk through times when they've been hurt, using their words and not their fists, not giving us the silent treatment or doing some of these more either actively or passively aggressive things. And I gotta say, sometimes, I don't exactly, those are hard things for me to do, to use my words and not use like silent treatment or not yell. So totally get it. And what we're seeing in a lot of schools is a concern for what's called the school to prison pipeline. It is a real thing that predominantly affects students of color, and particularly African-American students, where the likelihood that a student who's expelled or suspended from school, the likelihood that they end up in prison is like unnervingly high. And so the idea would be, can we use these dialogic processes like victim offender conferences so that instead of sending a kid into a touch with law enforcement, which once they get touched, they've got to go through the system, right? They go through these alternative processes where they actually learn, oh, this is why what I did was bad, because they may not have been taught that as a youth growing up, or they may have seen a parent or a parental figure in their life model these types of really problematic behaviors. And so the school then becomes a way to almost re-socialize youth into more constructive ways of working through difference and of just kind of working through those frustrations that you may feel. And so there's a socioeconomic, there's in some ways a legacy or a relational element, because in some of this work that I did through the Kansas Department of Corrections, working with some of their parole officers and juvenile justice folks, sometimes these kids are placed in homes that are, 3 hours away, and they don't get to see their friends, they don't get to see their families, and it just is excruciating. It actually leads to more wrongdoing later down the line. And so these communities are trying to explore ways that you can maintain connections, maintain a positive system of social support, so that these kids can learn better ways of behaving before they go off, ideally to college or to trade school or start pursuing employment, right? And so when I talk about some like the social justice opportunities of higher education, I'm thinking about these youth who may not have known any better, right? And then they get to come to college and they go, oh, I had no idea about all these opportunities. What an opportunity that we have, right, in our field to be able to change lives.
Thanks. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
We didn't get to talk about this, Greg, when you and I met earlier, but at some point I want to continue this part of the conversation, because the state of Texas has this disciplinary alternative education program system that is very interwoven with this problem that you're talking about with the school to prison pipeline and the relationship between the sort of subjective rule violations that can lead to social isolation in a disciplinary alternative education program, and then the 3-strike policies that exist for then sending you to juvie, and the implications, especially for young students of color. And there are kids in kindergarten getting sent to DAEPs. And it's just, I know that there have been some faculty here at A&M looking at that. And at one point I had started to develop a proposal, but it took up way too many other projects, but I'm very interested in this. And so thank you for the work that you're doing and for your wonderful answers today. So I hope that you all are able to meet with Dr. Paul during the next day and a half. We have a number of graduate students on the call, so I just wanted to remind them that even if you weren't signed up to meet during that group meeting, everyone is welcome to go to the graduate student meeting. So please join if you're available. And thank you so much, Greg, for your presentation.
Thank you all. I appreciated it.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Okay, so you get a little break here.